And now for something completely different.
Hello and welcome into another episode of the Get Cocky Podcast, part of the Gamecock Central Podcast Network. I'm your host, Pearson Fowler, and today's show will hopefully be a very enlightening one. Saturday's 38-27 loss to Florida was a strange game, but Will Helms has the advanced numbers that will hopefully tell the tale of the game, because we all know the box score clearly does not. So we're going to talk to Will for his usual Monday segment in just a minute. But first, I wanted to take a minute to thank all of you so much for listening and for subscribing. This has been a super weird football season, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to have a new format to discuss it. And none of this would have been possible without y'all tuning in on the reg. So thank you so much for that. And if you're new here, welcome. And if you've not yet rated, reviewed, or subscribed to the podcast, please do so. This really helps us. And when you subscribe to the podcast, you'll also get ACP, which Wes and Chris and I do on Wednesdays. You'll also get Wes and Chris. They do their No Huddle ACP either Sunday night or Monday morning just after the Carolina games. You'll also get Wes and Chris's Commit Cast, plus all the fun stuff that we have coming up that we're going to be doing with basketball season, which is right around the corner. So don't forget to subscribe. Thank you all so much. As we get started today, I'll just go ahead and say up front, the thesis of today's podcast, as it so often is both of these things can be true. So let me get started by saying that officiating did not cost South Carolina the football game on Saturday, but it did have a bigger impact on the game than any other game that I can remember watching, and certainly any other game this year. The only other one that really comes to mind is the Alabama game. And I mean, if you honestly say, does Carolina win that Alabama game if not for the missed field goal getting called back and the great punt that flipped field position and a couple other calls that maybe go Carolina's way? No. I mean, I think it's really a stretch to get there. Alabama won that game by 23 points. Does Carolina win this past Florida game if the officials don't gift the Gators two crucial touchdowns, including the long 75-yarder that, as much as anything, took the life out of the stadium that was just starting to get going? Maybe. I don't think it's as much of a stretch to get there as it would have been with the Alabama game, and I don't just say that because it was an 11-point margin. I say that because Carolina was leading after 3 quarters and had been dominating both lines of scrimmage. Now, unfortunately, this is a part of the game. Not just football, not just college football. This is all sports. This is what happens. And when I ask every single one of you listening who was in the Super Bowl last year, you're going to tell me that it's the Patriots and the Rams, and you're going to be right. You're not going to tell me that it was the Patriots and it should have been the Saints. At least that's not going to be your first take. And that was a case of a missed call that was so egregious that the NFL literally changed the rules. It wasn't this bad for Carolina. It was pretty terrible, but it wasn't like Nickel Roby-Coleman, whose name is going to live on in infamy as the answer to a trivia question for years to come, despite having a very average career. I mean, he's basically the Ted Stepien now of pass interference, or the Ted Stepien of the NFL, however you want to characterize him. So this is part of the game. This kind of stuff happens, and it hasn't even happened this Saturday. What happened to Carolina wasn't even like the worst instance of football officiating in the last calendar year. And to be honest, I'm not even that interested in relitigating what those missed calls were on Saturday. It's been rehashed already to death all over Twitter. I weighed in. I talked about it a little bit on my radio show today. It will probably come up again throughout the week, and I'm not going to totally avoid it. But where I wanted to go with this today is not even just the missed calls, the false start, the offensive pass interference, the holding are the 3 that immediately jump to mind. But for me, the problem is, and I will get off this in just a second, because I hate that this is a story as much as you do. It really should never be the biggest story or one of the biggest stories coming out of a game. And that's actually sort of where I'm going with this. But the problem for me is accountability. No other group of people in this entire country is as protected as officials in sports, not coaches or players or even the freaking POTUS. And at the heart of it, I do understand. In the case of college in particular, these guys are part-time employees, and frankly, people are lunatics about sports. Now, I don't know if this has happened in the United States. I'm sure it has, but frankly, I don't want to do the research to find out. But in other parts of the world, officials are literally murdered for making bad calls. Now, obviously, this is such an extreme case that I don't even need to mention this or how horrible it is. And I would like to think that we're civilized enough that that shouldn't be necessary in terms of like having police escort these guys out of stadiums. But in a weird way, the protection of the refs and refusal to, comment on calls and, be honest and transparent about these things, or just acknowledge that they make mistakes, because that's part of the game. And people are all willing to accept that. I guess the best example that I think of is when Jim Joyce cost Armando Galarraga that perfect game. He missed the call at first base. The guy was clearly out. He called him safe. And I remember it being like pretty immediate. I don't know if it was the next day or the next week, or it very well could have been right after the game. But Jim Joyce was was like so upset, and he was, saying, people make mistakes and that's not okay, and I cost this guy a perfect game. And he was like, I think he was even crying about it. He was getting emotional. And even after that, Armando Galarraga, came out in support of the umpire because people were really upset about it. But now it's become a story that's it's a much more positive story now, years later, and like even in the like sort of short-term aftermath, again, like the day after, people were like, oh, that's awful, he needs to never umpire again, like screw this guy, sending him threats on Twitter or whatever because he cost someone a perfect game, which totally sucked. But his transparency, his willingness to come out and be human and say, oh, I made a mistake, it cost this guy, that really humanized him, and that made it a lot easier to pull for him and be like, yeah, that sucks, that's part of the game. And everyone still remembers Armando Galarraga's near perfect game, to the point that there's even a Wikipedia page for it. You can find literally, I think it's called Armando Galarraga's near perfect game or 28 out perfect game or something like that. But that was only possible because Jim Joyce came out and was like willing to accept that he made a mistake. And I think that was like a very noble thing to do. And clearly people appreciated it. I very much appreciated it. And I think that's what's missing here. Now, to be fair, it's not like Carolina was cost a perfect game or, whatever other blown calls that we've seen throughout the year, like Nicole Roby-Coleman's pass interference. Who even knows if the Rams end up scoring on that play? There were other opportunities they could have won the game. That didn't cost them a game, and it's not like it was the Super Bowl. It was the NFC Championship, so like the second biggest game of the entire season. But that's even still a little bit different than a perfect game. But the point of all this is, it's the principle. It is the principle of accountability that's lacking, especially within college athletics, to the point where Will Muschamp could sit at the podium after the game and criticize himself. He could criticize his assistants. He could criticize the fans. He could criticize the vendors. We've seen that before. I don't remember if it was at a baseball game or a basketball game, but there was some Carolina game in the last couple of years where they ran out of water, or maybe that was even a football game. I don't know. You can criticize the vendors. You can criticize your own players. You can criticize the other team's players. You can criticize the other team's coach. You can criticize absolutely everything that you want to with no repercussions other than maybe some people lashing out at you on Twitter. But the second you open up your mouth about an official, you get slapped with a fine. And that is absolutely preposterous. There's no reason for it. People are much more forgiving in general when other people eat crow and admit that they're wrong. And if coaches were allowed to criticize officials, which they should be, because again, like, we're just like controlling speech here. This is basically a police state, which the NCAA it like really is. But I just hate how far it goes. Let the coaches and players and whoever criticize the referees, and then let the referees clap back. Let them have their own press conference after the game where they are asked questions about calls that they did or didn't make. That way there's a little more accountability. There's a little bit more pressure on them. I don't know what goes on internally. We would never know about it. And we don't even like necessarily need to know about it. I'm not like out for blood or anything like that. Again, I want some accountability, and I like transparency. I wish someone were able to ask the official after the game and say, hey, why did you make this call? What did you see? Let him explain himself. And then we can have like a discussion about it. And some people would be like, oh, I sort of see your perspective, and other people would disagree. But it at least creates sort of a healthy dialogue and a healthy environment. But right now, what we have is just this it's just us versus them. That sort of mentality that is a direct result of there being no transparency from the office of officials to the fans, coaches, players, etc. And I can kind of speak to this from experience because I'm not an official, but in terms of someone who's performance, for lack of a better word, opinions, ideas, thoughts, whatever, which is, it's a form of expression. That is sort of out in the open. I'm doing it right now, and I take all sorts of criticisms from people all the time, and I think it's great. I love it. I like to think I take most criticism in stride. I'm always open to, I know that I can be better at absolutely everything that I do. So when people say stuff, I'm like, oh, okay, is this a legit criticism? And if so, like, what can I do to fix this? But I also try to respond to people. I'm like, okay, well, you think I'm an asshole? Why do you think I'm an asshole? Maybe I'll work on that. Maybe, you think I'm stupid. Okay, well, what have I said that's stupid? Let me try to correct that. Let me try and strengthen my foundation of knowledge for like this one particular thing that you don't think I'm very smart about. Or maybe I'll disagree with you. But the point is, I try to engage with it. And I think that makes it easier. In my experience, people will be like, hey, you're dumb. And I'll be like, oh, cool. Thanks for listening. Why do you think I'm dumb? And they're like, well, oh, no, like, I don't actually think you're dumb. It's like they weren't expecting me to respond. So there's a human element that gets removed from the equation when officiating front offices treat their individual officials like this. But anyway, I think this also gets to another sort of interesting question, which is a much bigger question, long-term kind of question / possible solution that's wrapped up in like a whole bunch of other things. I mean, college football is changing before our very eyes. Maybe this will be part of the plan. Maybe it won't. But I think it's so curious that as big as college football has gotten as a business, it's still part-time employees that are like the ultimate adjudicators of everything right and wrong that happens over the course of a football game. Now, I get that it's part-time and that the football season is just a third of the year. So these guys can't work 12 Saturdays and then do nothing the rest of the year. I don't even know what the compensation is, but it seems like there is enough, like the college football business has gotten big enough that I feel like they would want the game to be pristine. They wouldn't want this kind of controversy. The SEC doesn't want it. The NCAA doesn't want it. The Big 12, the ACC, they don't want to have to deal with this. The best officials are the officials that you don't notice. It's like having a great offensive line. Like, you just don't want to notice these guys. I feel like college football and the conferences individually would want to invest in, I don't know if it's more training. I don't know if it is something that resembles full-time or what it is, but it seems like there is a way to fix this and to make it better so that we don't have to sit here and talk about it, because as much as, the SEC is just keeping their mouth shut and it's like people are like, oh, well, they clearly don't care. They're complacent. I mean, the reality is this probably drives them crazy. They probably hate having to deal with this, and they're just in a position where they just don't feel compelled to actually say anything or make any sort of public statements because that's how they operate. But I promise this is not what they're going for. They don't want this to be the storyline coming out of a conference game. Now, the bad news is none of this is going to change. Like I said, not in the immediate future. That last solution, if it's a solution, which I'm not even sure that it is a long way away anyway. Carolina has just been on the wrong end of it a lot more this season than usual. So that's the bad news. The worst news is, as I mentioned earlier, Carolina didn't actually lose this game because of the officiating. They lost it because they continue to be bad late in games. Now this season, 7 of 12 games have been played. Carolina has been outscored 66-45 in fourth quarters. And if you take out the Charleston Southern game, which you absolutely should, Carolina has been outscored 59-24. Yowza. Okay, wait. Let's go back to last year. Actually, last year is 79-79. So actually dead even in the fourth quarter, which is better than I expected when I started to go down this train of thought. But if you take out Coastal and Chattanooga, it's 64-58. So in the last 17 games against FBS opponents, Carolina has been outscored 123-82 in the fourth quarter alone. Now, I could probably go further and factor out garbage time because Carolina outscored Georgia 7-0 in the 2018 Georgia game, but obviously that game was over midway through the third quarter, so that doesn't count. But it's too much math and too much time, and y'all don't really care, or rather, you get the point. Last year, a lot of the fourth quarter / late game troubles, particularly in the Florida game, which, by the way, side note, South Carolina has been outscored 35-7 in the last 2 fourth quarters against Florida. So that's a disaster. But last year, a lot of this was related to terrible defense from a unit that had just been ravaged by injury all year. And this year, it seems to be more offensive anemia than anything else. Now, we've talked before about what the culprit of that seems to be. We talked, especially after the North Carolina game, that I'm very much in the camp that conservative offensive / general team approach, which trickles down from Will Muschamp, was the culprit. But this week it made a pretty compelling case to me that it might not all be on Will Muschamp and Brian McClendon getting too conservative. Now, again, I still think that's kind of the case, but this weekend's not necessarily the best game to reinforce that point because it was raining and Carolina was trying to throw it around and frankly just couldn't. So it's not like the coaching staff had a lot of options. But that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make here. Carolina keeps having reasons for why things aren't working out, either in general or in this case, late in games. And I say reasons because they aren't excuses, and I'm not one of those people that can't or won't differentiate reasons from excuses. I think that's really dumb. I don't know, that's kind of like a coaching thing, it seems. That's not me. I try to exercise more nuance than that. But in the case for Carolina, there are reasons for recent shortcomings. Like last year, a million injuries on defense and, inability to run the football because your running backs just aren't that good. And, Jake Bentley isn't that good. And this year, it starts out, Jake Bentley actually just isn't that good. And then he gets hurt and benched or some combination of the two. And, it's the defense that can't tackle. Or, Ryan Helinski was hurt and, didn't practice this week. Or the ball is wet. I mean, take your pick. There have been a lot of them. There have been a lot of, some of those are excuses. Some of those are reasons. I would say most of them are pretty legit reasons. But Carolina's at the point now, and it was on display against Georgia, a game in which Georgia made mistakes. Carolina did not make mistakes. Obviously, that helped propel Carolina to victory, but they were, even in the margins, they were close enough that if Georgia doesn't turn the ball over 4 times, Carolina doesn't win, but it probably still would have been a competitive game. Like, Carolina has the talent that they are good enough to be competitive with most of the teams that they play. But they're at the point where it doesn't need to be excuses or reasons anymore. They need solutions. You know who else is dealing with a wet ball on Saturday? Kyle Trask. You know who else has started actually fewer games than Ryan Helinski? Kyle Trask. You know who is playing on the road on top of all of this? Yeah, that's right. It's Kyle Trask. Kyle Trask, who also just made more plays down the stretch of that game than Ryan Helinski. And that was the difference. Now, I'm not saying Ryan Helinski is bad or should be benched or isn't going to be good or even that he lost the game for Carolina, because none of that is true or fair. But at some point, you just got to go out there and make plays. Sure, the referees gifted Florida 14 points that they may have gotten anyway. R.J. Roderick made 2 terrible plays that led directly to touchdowns, and Florida scored 38 on the road. It's a tall task to ask an offense that hasn't yet scored 30 points against an FBS opponent to score 40 in a game. But the fact that players are making plays in those same conditions, dealing with injuries or whatever, playing above their pay grades, and just making plays late in games, only it's not Carolina players, is troubling. Like, people win these games, and it's not Carolina most of the time because their players aren't the one making plays on the stretch. I mentioned right off the top, the stats for this game are pretty even, and like shockingly so when you consider the 11-point final score margin. I'm fascinated to see what the advanced numbers from the game look like, because on the one hand, they should be pretty good since all the other numbers are about even, and Carolina was better on third down and time of possession and running the football. But on the other hand, maybe these 11 points, these sort of mysterious 11 points that separated Carolina from Florida on Saturday, will actually show up in the Pro Football Focus numbers. So we're going to talk to Will Helms here in just a second to see if they actually explain what happened in this game, because it was a weird game, and I haven't totally figured it out yet. So here's Will Helms. All right, on the phone with me now, as always, for his normal Monday segment, Will Helms, who's got all the Pro Football Focus numbers that I'm hoping can make some sense out of the 11-point margin for Carolina. And, I mean, really, it was more like an 18-point margin. Carolina got a touchdown kind of in garbage time. But when you look at the box score, the number was very even. Carolina had more total yards, more rushing yards. They were better on third down, better time of possession. Turnovers were even. But there's something that's missing because, again, Carolina lost the game by 11 points at home. Is there any big trend that you notice in looking at the Pro Football Focus numbers that explains that deficit?
So I'm actually going to use some S&P numbers from Bill Connolly that actually I think do a really good job of helping that this week. One of the things that South Carolina has been really, really bad at this season, I'm talking like one of the worst in the country, is success rate on passing downs. So passing downs would be defined as basically second and long, third and long, things like that, where, you know, you're going to pass more often than you're not going to. And typically around the league, teams are going to be less successful on those downs. If you're in third and 25, technically a successful play would be a first down. So the success rate is a lot lower on average. But South Carolina is like 126th or 127th. I'm not quite sure off the top of my head in the country in that. And Saturday was another one of those. So if we're looking at success rate, South Carolina's success rate was actually really good, well above average for where they have been, but their passing down success rate was less than 20%. Ryan Helinski on those downs was 4 for 15 with 37 yards, took a sack and averaged 2 yards an attempt on those. Basically, all right, we basically have to pass the ball because it's second and long, third and long. And South Carolina's been really bad at that all season. And really showed against Florida because, you know, their success rate, Florida's wasn't much better at 29%, but South Carolina's at 19%. Whereas on standard downs, your first and 10, you're kind of, if you're moving the ball, second and 5, things like that, South Carolina was successful more than 50% of the time, which is well above national average. So that's something that I saw during the game, and then the numbers backed that up. And then the other thing is that while South Carolina's defense was very good, limited Florida to less than 4 plays per drive and pretty decent yards per play, their points per scoring opportunity, Florida's was 6.33 points per opportunity, which basically means 7 would be perfect. So national average is about a 4.4. So Florida was about 2 points more per opportunity to score than would be average. And so even if they had regressed to the mean on that, South Carolina had gotten 1 sack when needed. And think about that fourth down play where Javon Kinlaw just about sacked Kyle Trask. You get one of those stops, and it's a completely different sort of game.
So what exactly is defined as an opportunity in this points per opportunity?
So a lot of it is field position. It takes into account average field position, takes into account different advanced stats like where you are with the ball, what's the time of possession, what is the how's your field goal kicker, did you enter the red zone at, second or third and 9, or did you enter the red zone at second and 1 and have a pretty good opportunity, and uses basic national averages there to see what you would be expected to score. So normally in those opportunities, a lot of times it's, plus side of the field, you get a turnover there. You get good field position on a bad punt, things like that. Each drive is going to have a little bit, would be, oh, your opportunity here is kind of low. Oh, your opportunity here is really high. And so Florida ended up getting was only at 0.38 opportunities per drive. So it basically said on about 1 out of every 3 drives, they had the opportunity to score, maybe a little bit more than 1 out of 3 drives. But when they did have the opportunity to score, they averaged a touchdown basically every time they had the chance to score a touchdown.
That's absurdly opportunistic, and I'm guessing a real outlier for Florida offensively and Carolina defensively.
Absolutely. Across the season, South Carolina's actually been really good at that. Under Will Muschamp, they've been one of the best teams in the country at that, whether that's red zone defense or you think about back to the Georgia game, if they get a timely sack. Overtime, they did a really good job of forcing a long field goal, that kind of stuff. And against Florida, it just didn't happen. You think about J.C. Horn's interception, which, by the way, I don't know if he'll ever get an interception at this point, as many as he's had dropped or called back or things like that. But you think about a penalty on that. Really, that drive, I think they had 3 or 4 chances to stop Florida short, and Florida just kept going. And, eventually was able to punch it in for a touchdown in what seemed like forever on that, short field position drive.
I'm really glad there's a number for that, because my biggest takeaway, it's been really hard for me to make heads or tails of this game, which has kind of been the case for several Carolina games this year, but this even more than others, because, again, not only were the stats so similar, but the only thing that I could really identify is that Florida just kind of made more big plays. Obviously, the 75-yard touchdown, which, really shouldn't have happened for a couple of different reasons, but even, beyond that, you mentioned Kyle Trask being able to avoid the sack on the 3rd and 8, right before they scored the go-ahead touchdown to set up a 4th and 3, which was, also then a great play by Kyle Trask to roll out to his left and, find a receiver downfield to get the first down, to keep the drive alive, to keep the ball, to not give it back to Carolina, and then score the go-ahead touchdown a couple plays later. There's obviously the big play when they scored the first touchdown, which seemed to be a defensive error for Carolina. So I guess my summary was just Florida made more big plays, even if that didn't necessarily show up in the stat sheet, but it sounds like it is sort of showing up in the advanced metrics, at least in this S&P. And the quarterback play in particular, because you started with that, and that seemed to be the biggest difference for me too, because it was big plays made by Kyle Trask and not made by Ryan Helinski. What was the disparity in how each of them graded out on Saturday?
So actually, there wasn't a huge difference between how they graded out. Helinski actually graded out about a 1/10 of a point better. They were both slightly below average. But a lot of that has to do with Florida's skill players had some really good grades, especially Jacob Copeland, one of their receivers, had 85 offensive grade, which was the best for either team. And then, Kyle Trask ended up with a 58.3, and Ryan Helinski ended up with a 59.2. So Ryan actually graded out a little bit better than Trask. But I do think a lot of that has to do with Kyle Trask made a couple big plays. But other than that, South Carolina contained him pretty well. And he really wasn't that good. And we even think about the first long touchdown looked like Jamie Robinson and R.J. Roderick got a little tangled up there, or kind of took a bad angle or something and ended up being a jump ball that break a tackle and run for a touchdown. And then a lot of the other plays seemed to be a lot of Florida's receivers making plays, not consistently, but making a big play here or there that really changed it. But honestly, I think the biggest difference in this game, it's not going to be any one stat that we can look at, but this game, you had the 2 plays that stuck out to me were the Florida's 4th down conversion. If South Carolina stops them, if South Carolina gets, Javon Kinlaw gets to the quarterback there, which, by the way, he lined up and showed everybody in the world what he was going to do, and then pretty much did it successfully, lining up about a yard and a half off the ball and just bull rushing straight through the center. But if he gets to Trask there, I think it's a completely different game. And then you think about the 75-yard touchdown run, have a missed tackle there, have pretty obvious false start that was missed, a pretty obvious holding that was missed. And those two plays really end up being the difference in the game.
Yeah, I don't know if this shows up in S&P or in Pro Football Focus numbers, but I think we can all agree that even though Carolina had some guys that didn't have great games, Florida probably had some guys that didn't grade out well. I think the worst grade of the day goes to Matt Austin for his attempted explanation for why that wasn't a hold on the touchdown run.
Yeah, that was kind of weird, and I did not understand that at all.
I mean, clearly he didn't understand it either, but can we just go ahead and give him like a Pro Football Focus, like 0 out of 100?
Yeah, we should probably do that. Somebody suggested the other day, I think on Twitter, that they use different conferences referees because they'll have no problem saying that the SEC referees are horrible. But Matt Austin was definitely trying to stick up for his guy there, and I don't think he did that very successfully. Yeah,
no, didn't make a very compelling case on that. But that is neither here nor there at this point. I guess there's no way to assess these missed calls in terms of the numbers, so we'll just focus on, I guess, what we do actually have raw data for. I am pleasantly surprised to hear that Helinski graded out well, although he clearly missed some deep balls, and that was a difference for Carolina. But in terms of the offense, what they did exceptionally well all day was run the football. I was a little bit worried after Rico Dowdle went out early. Still no word on his injury. May get something from Will Muschamp tomorrow during his press conference, although I wouldn't expect a whole lot. But in his absence, Tavian Feaster had a career day. 25 carries, 175, I think it was, yards, and a touchdown. I was surprised to hear you say that he didn't grade out with the highest offensive grade of either team, but how did he do?
He had a pretty decent grade of a 67.3. A lot of him with being such an explosive runner, the more snaps he has, he's not going to have a huge jump in his score just overall with the way he's been playing. The most surprising thing to me this year is he's graded out pretty poorly in the past and has been one of the best in the country in the run, which if you had told South Carolina fans that last year that you'd get Tavian Feaster coming in and not really factoring in as a receiver, but being one of the best, just drop back running backs in the country, I think would be kind of surprising. But Brian Edwards, again, this week was the top-graded offensive player with a 70.2. South Carolina had a lot of players that in the slightly above average but not great range. They had 4 of their 5 offensive linemen graded out in that range. Feaster graded out at 67.3. You have Rico Dowdle in his one snap, graded out, pretty decently. And then you have a whole bunch of guys that are hovering right around that average of 60. But I think where we're seeing issues is that South Carolina, while they have Brian Edwards and at this point Tavian Feaster, there hasn't been a second receiver that has stepped up this year and been consistently a threat to, either hit a home run ball or just be a consistent third down target. If we look at the lowest grades of the day belong to 2 tight ends and 3 receivers are your lowest 5 grades of the day, which just can't really happen. And I think that it kind of hurts Ryan Helinski to not have another guy that he can really count on all the time like he can Brian Edwards.
Yeah, I mean, that has become really apparent. And a couple weeks ago, it felt like the conversation was who was the third guy, because I think people were still kind of hanging on to what Shi Smith did last year and saying he's clearly the second best guy. But in terms of productivity, I mean, I guess he's second on the team in catches, but just hasn't had an impact at all. So it's not even the third receiver as much as, what you're saying, which is the second receiver. And I guess that would be something to the people that have really criticized Brian McClendon and criticized him on Saturday. I thought the game plan was fine. I thought Carolina showed a good mix of things. They threw down the field. They had some diversity in the running game, more pin and pull. We saw that kind of mixed in with some counter actions as well. We saw Carolina attempt a toss that didn't go well, but that wasn't the fault of the play calling. So I think those arguments are a little bit silly, but where we may have a valid criticism for Brian McClendon is that is his group, the wide receivers. And whether it's Xavier Legette, whether it's Chavis Dawkins, whether it's Josh Vann, Shi Smith, no one has really been able to emerge. And football is such a complex game, so I'll be curious to get your take on this. But Carolina's passing game in general has just been, pretty poor for most of the season. I guess you could just call it inconsistent if you want to. Some of that had to do with a couple of different starting quarterbacks, obviously Ryan Helinski being injured. Some of that has to do, I think, with the offensive line and shaky pass protection at times, and some of it has to do with wide receiver play. It sounds like, at least in the case of this game, of those 3 facets, it's probably mostly on the receivers in terms of Carolina only ending up with 170 passing yards.
Yeah, so 38 pass attempts, 10 pressures, and of those 10 pressures, they definitely, which was the correct call by PFF, gave the sack to Ryan Helinski. He should have recognized the blitz from the slot. If he does, I have no problem with that play call whatsoever. They had shown some diversity in the running game. Some of your the field gets condensed as you get down onto like the 5 or 6 yard line. They decide to pass it, and Helinski just missed the blitz on that one. But the overall team allowed 10 pressures on the game. Helinski got hit 4 times, which when you throw it 38 times is not the worst thing in the world. Like that could definitely be better. I think the rain had a little bit to do with it. I also think just the inconsistency with, Ryan Helinski gets hurt last week, playing by far the best game of his career against Georgia, gets hurt, is coming back. Even if he practiced fully, he's still limited a little bit. A little bit of reps are there. Somebody suggested that in the rain, maybe your guys are a step slow, so some of those deep balls that look like they were just overthrown may be, perfect throws in better conditions and things that, Ryan Helinski is going to have to adjust to. But at the same time, I saw a thread on Gamecock Central about how, was Jake Bentley, where was Jake Bentley at this point in his career? And I kind of tongue-in-cheek commented still on the bench because his first game was the 7th game of the season. So at this point, we're looking at Ryan Helinski having faced 3 top 10 defenses, playing through 2 injuries in bad weather conditions today or Saturday. And he's still been decent enough, and they've been able to win games with him. Now, he hasn't gone out and won a game yet, and I think he will do that, whether that's next week at Tennessee. But I think there's going to be some game where he's going to go out and he's going to have a career day and really inject some life into the offense. But I didn't really have a lot of concerns with the offense, honestly, against a very good Florida Gator defense in some pretty bad conditions and down a starting running back. I thought actually the offense was pretty good to put up 27 points. The story of that game, I think, is South Carolina is just a little bit unlucky. Even they forced a couple fumbles and didn't recover them. You got the big play to I can't remember who it was. It may have been Copeland that scored against Jamie Robinson. PFF thought that was really good coverage. Just maybe a missed timing there, or you don't make the tackle after you go for the jump ball, anything like that. Florida hit a couple plays that may have been a little bit lucky for whatever reason. I think that's the more of the storyline than South Carolina's offense wasn't good because, the success rate looks good. The South Carolina's running backs, I think fans get a little frustrated with they would rather see South Carolina go out and throw it for 500 yards a game than to go out and control the clock and run it for 200 yards. But Mon Denson played well. Tavian Feaster played well. And so I think it's just a different look than we're used to from South Carolina, but that doesn't mean it can't be successful.
No, and I really appreciated that. I've been saying for a couple of years now that Carolina needs to rely more on running the ball just because at this point, whether it's Jake Bentley, whether it's Ryan Helinski, young and injured and playing in the rain or whatever, they need to focus on running the ball more, especially as well as they do it this year. Don't ask your quarterbacks to do too much because, frankly, like you said, they don't have a quarterback right now that has proven that he can, to this point, go out there and win you a football game. Not to say that Ryan Helinski's not going to be that guy, or not that he's not that guy right now, but he hasn't done it yet, so you don't want to ask him to do too much. And to your other point, I said, I don't remember if I said it on another Carolina podcast or on my local show on 107.5 The Game, but I said last week that this is probably a race to 30. And if you told me that Carolina scored 27 points against what you're correctly pointing out is an excellent Florida defense, I would have thought Carolina won the game. And the flip side of that, kind of what you're saying with Carolina getting unlucky is definitely true. But I look at it a little bit differently and just say, because I don't know how I feel about luck, and I don't want to get off on like a whole philosophical tangent here, but it just seems like when Carolina is in close games, I guess the Georgia game being a notable exception because they made way more mistakes than Carolina in that game, but it just seems like other teams have players making plays more than Carolina has that. And for Kyle Trask, he started actually fewer games than Ryan Helinski in his career, and he was doing this on the road. He was dealing with the same wet ball. You could say that his playmakers were, I think Florida's got a better group of receivers than Carolina, and it sounds like that was borne out in the numbers, but that would be the only frustration. Again, not that I think this is on Helinski, not that, he should have had to go out there and throw for, 360 yards to win the football game, but it's just a little bit frustrating when the reasons for one guy not succeeding are very similar in terms of the situation to another guy who just happens to be succeeding. Kyle Trask, maybe he didn't play as well as Helms in terms of the PFF numbers, but the difference was kind of the plays that he made, the ability to extend plays at times that what ended up being the first time Florida took the lead, he converted 2 third downs with his leg. Obviously, you mentioned was able to scramble around and get Florida into a 4th and 3, and then it was his legs again that helped him convert that 4th and 3 to keep Carolina off the field, and then to go ahead and score that touchdown, and obviously threw those 2 touchdown passes to ice the game late. So that was just something that really stood out to me and wasn't totally borne out in the numbers, but it's at some point it's just about making plays, I feel like.
Absolutely, and I think if you were to flip those two and say, if Ryan Helensky doesn't or sees the blitzer there and is able to deliver a ball, he had Brian Edwards open over the middle of the field, and I think he was just waiting for a little bit more separation. If he gets that out a little bit quicker, which usually he is, he's by the numbers the quickest trigger in the SEC right now. If he gets that out a little bit earlier, and let's say Kyle Trask doesn't hit that pass as he scrambled out on 4th and 3, that's a completely different game. And so a lot of times I do kind of subscribe to the theory that you can't really control close games. There isn't really, other than Nick Saban, a coach in any level of football that can say I'm substantially more successful in close games than the average person as far as it goes ratio to their, to how they play overall. Nick Saban obviously wins a lot of close games because Nick Saban wins a lot of games in general. But at the same time, South Carolina does need to have, they do need to hit that pass. And we've said it for years of, well, they were 1 pass away. Well, last week against Georgia, we see they made the plays when they needed to, and Georgia didn't. This week, they didn't make the plays against Florida when they needed to.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair distinction. I guess it felt like the margins were a little tighter because I didn't leave that game thinking that Florida was 11 points better than Carolina. I left that game feeling like it was a very winnable game for Carolina. I think most Carolina fans felt that way, and it just felt like a familiar refrain, to the North Carolina game, and I mean even to the Missouri game, which is, I guess the most unreasonably lopsided result this season for Carolina. The Alabama one's the only one that you look at and say, yeah, Carolina's probably 23 or 24 points worse than Alabama, but I don't know if they are top to bottom a worse team than North Carolina. I definitely don't think they're 20 points worse to a Missouri team that just lost to Vanderbilt, and I don't think they're 11 points worse than Florida. So I guess it's more about just sort of looking for where those margins are. And I mean, you're probably exactly right, just in terms of it almost being a toss-up. It sounds like just, I don't want to say random because it's guys making plays, but over, say, a 10-year span that stuff probably evens out. But it just, at home and in that kind of setting, and especially as much as Carolina controlled both sides of the line of scrimmage and the tempo of that game for the first 3 quarters, to collapse that significantly in the 4th quarter for the second year in a row, I think it has a lot of people, myself included, really asking hard questions.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I will say the flip side of that is that this is the first time that you looked at South Carolina and said, wow, they can actually hang with this top 10 team, and we can argue whether Florida actually is a top 10 team. I think they're very good. I also think it was a weird game Saturday, and so maybe hard to judge just from that. But at the same time, you can look at that and say, okay, South Carolina just beat a top 5 team on the road, came back home and played with another top 10 team for 3 quarters. And, we could say, Will Muschamp takes a lot of criticism, and some of it rightfully so, but, Steve Spurrier would make mistakes a lot of times too. He would go and, beat Alabama and then lose the next week to Kentucky. So it's not like it's ever something new. And I think that's a lot of what frustrates South Carolina fans, is that they're hoping for, maybe this is the year that, we string together a couple wins and, things go right for us. And, hey, it's end of October and we're still in the SEC East hunt, and we haven't been there in a while. And then you lose to Florida, and it's, back to square one. You're 3-4, and doesn't really get any easier going forward.
And for Carolina, fans, the way that the season is turned around, I mean, if I told you 3 weeks ago that you'd be coming off the biggest upset in school history, and then a game where you lost late but were leading after 3 quarters, I mean, that would have been unforeseeable after the Missouri game. Just the way that they've turned around the season in terms of confidence and the energy is outstanding, especially going into a stretch where Carolina is probably going to be favored in the next 3 games. And then you have a trip to College Station, which looked daunting at the beginning of the season, and Texas A&M looks like the wheels are dangerously close to coming off. I have no idea what Texas A&M team South Carolina will see when they make their way to College Station, but they still have, a possibility to finish the season very strong despite this disappointing Florida game. One other place I wanted to go with this, though, I meant to ask you this earlier, but I'm glad we had that as sort of a tangent, because that was good. I think that's what people are looking for in terms of answers to some of those bigger questions. But I think one other thing that we haven't talked about from Saturday necessarily that was a little bit surprising was that Florida was able to score 38 points. They're a team that has been inconsistent offensively. I think they've been better under Kyle Trask. They haven't been explosive running the ball, and obviously they had the huge 75-yard touchdown run. But I didn't see a scenario where Florida was going to score that many points against Williams-Brice. But I also didn't feel like the defense played terribly. And it doesn't sound like the numbers necessarily affected that either, unless they did, and I'm just mistaken.
So you're absolutely right. And to kind of point out how weird of a game it is, Florida was below national average in success rate, which generally is a fairly decent measure of how good an offense is working. They were below national average in success rate in 3 of 4 quarters. And you would expect, okay, the fourth quarter is when they did well. No, they were below national average in success rate in the fourth quarter. So they hit some timely plays when they needed to, got bailed out by a couple penalties, things like that. But the second quarter was the only quarter where they were above 40% in success rate. So the first, third, and fourth quarters, they're running less than 50% successful plays. And South Carolina was able to stop a lot of that. You give up the big touchdown on the 75-yard touchdown run. That hurts, obviously. It still only counts as one successful play, so it doesn't really help your success rate that much. But I think it did change the course of the game, and I think the momentum shifted there. One of Florida's touchdowns, I think, wouldn't have happened. South Carolina has to go for it on 4th and 3 from their own maybe 35 or something like that. Florida gets really good field position. So I think that later in the game, some of the things made it look a little bit more lopsided than it maybe should have been. But at the same time, you look at it, and it was a weird game that pace-wise. Florida had 16 drives, which is well above the national average of 12.5. Ran way fewer plays than national average, had a lot of 3-and-outs, had a lot of unsuccessful drives. Really didn't average that many yards per play, but really made the most of their scoring opportunities. And I think that's where that's not sustainable for a team throughout the season, and it just happens sometimes. The flip side of that would be last year against Missouri. Missouri, in that weird monsoon game, had one of the worst success rates, or one of the worst what's the word I'm looking for? One of the worst points per scoring opportunity I've ever seen from a game. And that's not sustainable for a defense. That's not sustainable for an offense. But sometimes you're going to have those outlier games. And I think that Saturday probably was one of those. And so I guess a long roundabout answer is yes, the numbers show that South Carolina's defense played really well. If we look at even just pure PFF grades, 9 of 11 starters had an above-average PFF grade. The only ones that had below-average grades were J.C. Horn, who, by the numbers, didn't really have a poor impact on the game, only gave up 2 receptions for 19 yards, and R.J. Roderick ended up having a below-average game for the first time this season. And so those were your only 2 starters that end up with what PFF would describe as a below-average game. Yet South Carolina gives up 38 points. And so I think sometimes you just have to say that while, yes, you need to prevent that and you need to try to stop that from happening, you have weird games. A similar game would be Illinois and Wisconsin. Illinois made the most of their scoring opportunities. They, like Florida, had, I think, averaged 6 points a scoring opportunity and didn't have that many opportunities. But it was enough to win against a really, really good Wisconsin defense that really didn't play poorly at all in the game.
Yeah, both cases of like some of the most bizarre snowball effect that I've seen. I think that's probably a fair way to categorize what happened in both of those games, and especially this Carolina game late. Not surprised to hear you say that R.J. Roderick had one of the 2 worst grades on the team. I think just based on the eye test, I think he was probably, I don't know exactly how Pro Football Focus characterized this, but he seemed to be responsible for both of Florida's long touchdowns. Obviously, the one that you mentioned earlier, that I guess it was Copeland. Is he number 15? That he caught it in between Jamie and Roderick, and then Roderick. It looked like he was maybe trying to play the tip. I don't know if he thought that Jamie was going to get there or had gotten there, but in any case, if you're a safety, your job is to make sure that nothing gets behind you, not to necessarily be opportunistic first. I thought that was a pretty poor play. And then the 75-yard touchdown run, it shouldn't have happened because of the hold and because of the false start. That was, clearly R.J. Roderick had gotten out of position and just left a hole that you could have driven a 8-team wheeler through, and that seemed to be his responsibility. So no surprise there. JC, I would imagine he had a couple of good coverages. There was one just like fade basically down the sideline. He did a good job of using the sideline as a second defender, and whoever the Florida receiver was caught it, but it was out of bounds. I thought that was a nice play by him. I imagine his run defense grade was pretty poor because it seemed like he got kind of caught out there in the open, missed some tackles and let some guys get yards after contact. So I would imagine that's where his grades were low. And on the flip side of that, I know Jamie Robinson did give up that touchdown, or he was in coverage when the touchdown was given up. If they gave most of the blame to Roderick, I would say that maybe this is still the case, but based on what I watched, I would say he was probably one of the better defenders out there for Carolina on Saturday. Did he have one of the higher grades on the team?
So you'd be exactly right there. His overall grade was a 70.7. He didn't grade out very well against the run, but he had his second-best coverage grade of his career. And just to give you an indication of how PFF works, coming into this game, he'd given up 7 career catches for 85 yards and no touchdowns. And what he was credited with, at least, is he was targeted 5 times and gave up 5 receptions for 45 yards. Had the interception, had the long touchdown, which they didn't really blame him for. It wasn't really a great throw, went up there and I think just got caught out on a jump ball, but expected to have safety help. And then other than that play, ended up giving up 4 catches for 8 yards, forced a fumble on one of them, didn't miss a tackle, and then had the interception on the overthrown ball, I think early in the third quarter. And so he ended up with a 73.8 coverage grade, which despite the numbers that look like they're not that great, giving up a touchdown and giving up 5 receptions on 5 targets, he had one of the better coverage grades of his career. And so that just kind of shows how PFF doesn't necessarily use the stats in the same way that we might just look at a box score and attribute, blame or credit to a player.
Yeah, well, that's good because his tackling in space after the catch really impressed me on multiple occasions. Yeah. I guess that's borne out in the 4 catches for 9 yards or whatever it was after just the touchdown that he gave up early. Yeah,
definitely. As always, Javon Kinlaw was number 1, highest graded player in the game for I think 6th time this season. He ended up with a better rush defense grade than pass defense grade this game, which is a little bit rare for him. But I mean, he's one of, I think, 9 players in the SEC with an elite rush defense grade and pass rush grade. Aaron Sterling played well, and then JT Ebay has actually been one of the best players on the team the past 3 weeks. 3rd straight game with at least a 72 defense grade, was the highest graded player other than Kinlaw against the run, had the highest tackling grade, and had an above-average coverage grade. So just have to give JT Ebay a shout-out for being much better than a lot of people have given him credit for recently.
Yeah, had a couple big plays. I mean, he made some tackles in space on Saturday, which was nice. And then I think we mentioned it last week, but had a huge play late in that Georgia game to keep them out of comfortable field goal range, so they had to attempt a Hail Mary there at the end of the game. His improvement has been nice to see throughout the season. Now, if Carolina could just get both of their safeties to play a really good game at the same time, maybe they'd sure up the back end and not give up those huge plays like that. Was there anything else that stood out to you in terms of trends or numbers on defense? Anyone that had a better game than it seemed like just watching the game, or a little bit worse than what it seemed like watching the game?
I think one of the things I was going back through, this is more of a season grade thing, but South Carolina's defense has been really good this year. And I think a lot of it has to do with there's no weak link. If you look at the snap totals and the PFF grades of players, most teams that I looked at, and admittedly I didn't look at every team in the country, will have a couple outliers here and there that are having poor games or poor seasons. But you have to go all the way down to 32 snaps to find the first South Carolina defender with a below-average grade. Other than Jemias Williams has a below-average grade. He has more snaps than that, obviously not with the team anymore. I think he would have started to lose some of his snaps to eBay and Roderick and Robinson and that combination in the back. But I think South Carolina's defense this year it's not as much that there's a ton of stars on this defense, it's that there aren't a lot of weak links. And while South Carolina could probably have a couple more stars on offense to, have an explosive play here and there, like Florida was able to have I think that South Carolina's defense, this is definitely a trend, and it's not something that's just a game or two. That I think the rest of this season we can look at South Carolina's defense as being one of the better defenses in the conference, I think.
Yeah, well, that's good news with a couple more tough, or I say tough, not really tough, going to Tennessee and Texas A&M, but 2 more road games. And if defense travels, and if Ryan Helinski, I don't know exactly what his health is going forward. He actually, he moved around pretty well. It looked like on a couple of those deep balls, he didn't step into the throw, which Eric Kimmery said was probably a case of him protecting his leg a little bit, even if not totally consciously. But he ran a quarterback draw and got 4 or 5 yards. He kept the ball on a quarterback read. He may have had another rushing attempt. I don't totally remember, but he didn't look. It's not like he was limping around the field Saturday, so that's good news for Carolina. But always good when you can back your defense and take it on the road, which they're going to have to do next week as they go up to Knoxville, where they're I think a 4.5-point favorite is where that line opened to try to. I say get back on track. The Florida game wasn't a disaster. It was good for 3 quarters. Unfortunate, somewhat inexplicable, kind of unlucky, if you want to call it, that snowball effect there at the end. But, Will, I appreciate you helping us break this down. And I'm glad in some ways that the numbers say that Carolina played a good game. In some ways, it's kind of frustrating, but I'm also glad that you were able to bring in the S&P to kind of explain how much of an outlier this was for Florida in terms of their offensive efficiency, because I think that probably more than anything else tells the story of what happened on Saturday.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks, man. And y'all don't forget to follow him on Twitter at WHelms21, and be sure to check out his company. The website is prepra.com, prep-ra.com. It's SAT prep and tutoring and basically everything you could possibly need to help student athletes get into school so they can play college and actually be student athletes, because that's something that we all value here. Will and I both value education very much, and I really think that is like the coolest thing ever. And I don't know if other people are doing this. I certainly haven't heard of it, but I think that's such an awesome and underrated part of, like I said, getting someone into school and letting them pursue their career as a student athlete at whatever the next level may be for them. So more information there, prep-ra.com. Will, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next week.
Appreciate it.
All right, thanks again so much to Will. Great stuff as always. Don't forget to follow on Twitter at WHelms21. Check out his website, prepra.com. That's prep-ra.com. Not my favorite weekend ever to be on Twitter. It was a lot of angry people, and not angry after the Missouri game, where it's, kind of funny because it's, I don't know, like humorous negativity, like the kind of negativity that people practice as a means to cope with something sad like their team just laying an egg. But it was much more genuine vitriol this week directed at the officials. So not a lot of great stuff from Gamecock Twitter, but I did see these 2 things, both from the world of college football, that I wanted to mention as our best from social media before we get out of here this weekend. First of all, this is from Saturday Down South. For those of you that missed it, at the beginning of the Oklahoma game, they drive that wagon that's behind a couple of horses across the stadium as sort of part of their intro, and it's a whole big thing. Well, they took a sharp left turn, did the horses, on Saturday for whatever reason, and it sent the cart spilling over and all the contents of the cart, including the people, falling out all over the field. If you haven't seen the clip, you should go watch it because it makes more sense if you've actually seen it. But Saturday Down South just tweeted the video with the caption, "Me when the hot donuts now sign is on at Krispy Kreme." So that was good. Very accurate. Also, I just wanted to mention this because so much of this weekend for Carolina fans was about poor officiating, and they were not alone. Lane Kiffin was also upset with the officiating. He got fined actually $5,000 for his criticism of the officials, but not in the press conference and not on the sideline. He took to Twitter after a game and tweeted at Conference USA. That's all the tweet says. And the picture is a picture of 3 officials wearing, the dark sunglasses that blind people will wear with seeing eye dogs, and those sticks, forgive me for not knowing what exactly they're called, but the sticks that help blind people actually walk around, implying that, yes, the referees of Conference USA are blind. He was fined $5,000, which is definitely worth it because he won social media, and I know that's really all Lane Kiffin cares about. So Lane Kiffin, thank you so much. You are a treasure. Do not ever change. That's all we got for y'all this week. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to rate, review, subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends if you like it and you want us to keep doing it. Also, be sure to check out all the great coverage of South Carolina football. And like I said, we've got the 2 basketball teams season starting up very soon. Gamecock Central is a great place to check all that out. And if you're not an insider on Gamecock Central and you want to try it out for a month for free, you can use the exclusive podcast code GCPOD. That'll give you a month Gamecock Central insider access for free. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you again Friday.